Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We will start in just 2 minutes. Thanks very much. Hello, and thank you for joining the latest in the webinar series hosted by Cardinal Commerce. I'm Paul Harrison, Head of Sales Enablement and Business Development at Cardinal. I'm delighted that so many of you could join us today from all parts of the globe. Before we do get started, on behalf of Cardinal and Visa, I would like to acknowledge the plight for many that COVID-19 has brought and continues to bring, and we certainly hope that everyone and their families remain safe. Just as a practical side note for our audience, there is a Q&A box on your screen where you can post any questions you might have, and we'll certainly leave time at the end of the webinar to address as many of those as possible. Please note that as a registered guest, you'll also receive a recording of this webinar. And finally, in the context box on your screen, you'll see a link to previously hosted Cardinal webinars. Now, I'm very excited to welcome 2 guests today, Matt Gulosh, who's Senior Manager for Product Delivery and Commercialization at Cardinal, and Kevin Maxham, Director of Product Management at Mastercard. Matt and Kevin, welcome. Perhaps you'd like to share, it's good to hear your voice. Perhaps you'd like to share a bit more about what you actually do.
Sure thing. Thanks, Paul, for the introduction. As you mentioned, I'm Matt Gulosh, and I head up product delivery and commercialization here at Cardinal Commerce, which means that I get to work with a lot of different areas within our organization, but also I get to work with a lot of the networks and our partners on these type of emerging solutions like Identity Check Insights.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Paul. Kevin Maxham here. Thank you to the whole Cardinal team, really, for hosting this session and having me on today. So I'm part of Mastercard's cyber and intelligence team focused on the North American market. And in my role, I interact really frequently with issuers, merchants, and 3DS service providers, really all with the goal of scaling what I'll call healthy usage of the new EMV 3DS ecosystem. So very excited to be here today to dive in on the data-only use case.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for that, and that certainly confirms that you're both the ideal guests for today's topic. Now, it is critically important to note that today is indeed Matt's birthday, so a very happy birthday to you, Matt. Kevin, I think you were saying you wanted to sing happy birthday to Matt on the webinar. Was that correct?
I'm happy if there is singing. I'm not sure I'm the right guy to. I'm not sure I'm the right guy to sing, but some level of singing would be great. No.
Okay. Oh, very good.
I did a webinar on Identity Check Insights last year for my birthday. So every year, that's what I try and do for my birthday. It's a really exciting opportunity for me.
Great. And yeah, next year's is already slated, so wonderful. Well, listen, we're sorted, so let's get started. Now, I think everyone should find today's topic concerning data only to be of particular interest. Why? Well, while it's a relatively new concept, data only is already generating a lot of attention in the ecosystem, as it is potentially a very viable means to help merchants optimize authorization approval rates in specific markets and regions. So today we'll be specifically addressing what is data only and how does Mastercard's version of it, Identity Check Insights, specifically work. We'll also share very encouraging results from Mastercard's pilot program carried out both in the US and Latin America. And finally, we'll highlight what you as a merchant must do to participate. But first, Matt, perhaps you might be able to describe from a Cardinal perspective how this data-only initiative came about.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Paul. I mean, obviously, I told you this is very near and dear to my heart, not because I only get to talk about it every birthday of mine, but also because it's one of the first projects that I started working on when I joined Cardinal. So I've really had the opportunity of seeing its full evolution. As you mentioned, Mastercard, they've been working with us since 2018 to create a solution that incorporates authentication with authorization, because in North America and some of these other unregulated markets like Latin America and in the Caribbean region, some merchants were more concerned about providing a frictionless experience to their consumers over liability shift. I think it makes sense to maybe take a quick step back and briefly touch upon EMV3DS and its evolution so that we can frame the data-only experience. Historically, there have been some challenges around EMV 3D Secure. Around 3D Secure 1.0, mainly because it was a protocol that was built for a browser experience, and it is a little bit of an older protocol now that was built using technologies from the late 90s and the early 2000s. And a lot's changed since then. The way we transact online is different. The systems used to process those transactions have evolved. And really, in my opinion, the expectation from the consumer is higher due to the pace at which everything's moving today from a technology standpoint. So this is really where EMV3DS came about, as an updated way to answer that call for an updated experience. And the EMV3DS protocol, it allows for the Internet of Things, those smart devices, and mobile transaction experiences to happen through things like SDKs or software development kits. And it was specifically built with these types of devices in mind. It also allows the capability to pass roughly 10 times more data in authentication than what was available in the 1.0 protocol. And it's a much cleaner experience using risk-based decisions by the issuer, as well as those things like one-time passcodes and biometrics in authentication, in that authentication process when there are actually those higher risk transactions. And this is fantastic for many of our clients and customers because some of them love the liability shift. It gives them peace of mind that comes around this. And because it gave that older protocol a pretty massive and needed facelift. That said, EMV3DS it's a very dynamic protocol, one which has a lot of functionality that we're only beginning to tap into. And as this new protocol was coming out, we knew that there was still a gap in the ecosystem, specifically when it came to these unregulated markets where two-factor authentication wasn't a hard requirement, and historically there hasn't been as much adoption. What Mastercard saw and what we saw was that some merchants were still trying to figure out how they could get information to their issuers and work with their issuing counterparts to share this additional information in authorization for real-time decisioning. And specifically, it was some of the ones that weren't participating in 3D Secure. So these merchants, they were pursuing these solutions, and they had a slightly different focus, mainly because they may have their own fraud tools, or fraud just isn't as much of a problem within their industry organization. And therefore, they were not as concerned with liability shift as they were with how can I optimize speed, how can I ensure that there's no chance of friction or a challenge experience, yet how can I still have this positive impact on approval rates and not at the cost of higher fraud. And if they could get this additional information into authorization, based on this richer data set that was now in authentication, then better decisions could still be made around fraud, approval, and reduce false declines. So that is really where data only was born, and we really see it as a powerful answer to that gap we were seeing. And it's a use case that we're pretty excited to talk to you guys about today. It's an answer that Cardinal has been working on with Mastercard and with Visa to provide a solution within these unregulated markets. And as you mentioned a little bit earlier, today we'll be focusing on the results and key findings from our partnership with Mastercard and their network solution called Identity Check Insights. And as I mentioned, it's a partnership that really began in the fall of 2018 when I first joined the Cardinal team. So it's been exciting to work with Mastercard on this to help drive the ecosystem, to change the way we think of traditional 3DS. And it's also been a long journey to prove out something, that something new like this has value, and to make sure that it's sound from a functionality and testing standpoint, and then really to reach a critical mass and adoption so that it'll hopefully take off and impact the market the way we see that it will.
Okay, so great. Thanks, Matt. A lot of very useful information there. So just to reiterate, those key benefits of this data only are really down to what? Improved decisioning, risk decisioning, reducing the latency, and then ultimately increasing those approvals and reducing false declines, correct?
Yeah, you got it. I think this slide does a great job of summarizing those impactful benefits. It's very exciting to talk about where we've been, where we're going, and what we've been seeing recently around this solution. And I'm excited for Kevin to go into some of those details around our collaboration. But the main points that I'd really like the audience to keep in mind as we walk through this today are the benefits of improved authorization, like you mentioned, the focus on reduced latency, and the ability to make those better decisions in authorization, even though there isn't necessarily a step up or a challenge, which again is mainly due to those insights from authentication that are being used by the issuers in an authorization environment.
Okay, great. So I think that really helps to put the concept of data only in context. And of course, today we're here to specifically discuss Mastercard's data only solution, Identity Check Insights. So Kevin, would you mind walking us through the workings of the Mastercard solution? How does it specifically work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Paul. Just from a quick terminology perspective, as part of our broader identity check program, which is essentially Mastercard's branding for our 3D secure ecosystem, we offer this Identity Check Insights flow to all participating merchants. So this Identity Check Insights flow, which I'll be referring to as Insights throughout, really that was what was previously known as data only. And just from a participation perspective, really there's no limitations or restriction in terms of who can participate from the merchant perspective. Really, as long as all the EMV 3DS data can be collected and passed, there's no global restrictions, and essentially any merchant can participate. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the new use cases, such as recurring payments that'll come with the evolution of the EMV 3DS spec. But nonetheless, we've built it in a relatively flexible way that should be available to most, if not all, merchants. So in this slide, we'll just quickly depict how the Identity Check Insights transaction is actually processed within the 3DS transaction flow. So similar to a full payment authentication path, which is really just the typical 3DS use case, the merchant here, in partnership with their server provider, like Cardinal, collects and passes the full EMV 3DS payload. So this is including things on the new spec like device IDs, browser details, IP address data, now shipping address data. And really, once that data is collected and managed within that server environment, the processing is essentially managed by the server provider and by the network, again, with absolutely no impact to the consumer experience. So let me maybe just take it a layer down and get into a little bit more detail as to what's going on behind the scenes. But as compared to that typical full payment authentication transaction, the major distinction in the routing here for an insights or data-only transaction, the merchant essentially flags the transaction using a specific message category code within the 3DS payload. And this code is then interpreted by the network, basically just to direct the authentication request down the insights path. Really what this means is that this insights transaction will never flow out to an access control server, which is the issuer's service provider in the 3DS flow. And this is really critical because that transaction is not flowing out to an access control server, we can always say with 100% confidence these transactions will never be challenged by an issuer, so they won't be stepped up with a one-time passcode, for example. And it also limits the end-to-end timing, right, or latency of the transaction, since we're essentially suppressing that second leg of a typical authentication request. Also, when this authentication data reaches the network level, it passes through, from the Mastercard perspective, our advanced AI modeling, and that allows us to basically add additional context to the authorization in real time. And that comes through in the form of a network risk score that I'll get into some more detail on subsequent slides. But ultimately, this is done to help the issuer make more informed decisions in authorization. I'll just touch on maybe one more critical piece of the processing that helps to facilitate some of the great results we've started to see. So in addition to that message category code, there's another critical field that helps Mastercard facilitate that real-time linking and the passing of the risk score into the authorization. And it's called the Directory Server Transaction ID. Essentially, this acts as the unique link between the authentication and the authorization. And this is a net new field for the EMV 3DS spec. Now, the good news is it's already built in as part of the Mastercard EMV 3DS requirements, and it's widely supported in the market. But I just wanted to call out this piece in particular because it really does allow for the 100% real-time matching of that authentication data into authorization. And this is net new as part of this processing flow. So it's an important piece.
Okay, thanks very much. So again, that I think really kind of stresses that, as you said, because it's not reaching the ACS, the latency piece is any sort of latency associated with a typical authentication transaction is going to be suppressed. Okay, well, I think it might be worth talking about focusing a little bit how Cardinal and Mastercard have worked with each other over the past year in particular. Matt, Kevin, can you touch on that?
Absolutely, Paul. So first and foremost, end-to-end testing. We needed to ensure that there was no negative impact to the merchants and issuers, and this is always a main focus in developing our solutions. You know, there can always be nuances and unknowns as we move into new protocols and work through those early days of a major overhaul, but we take our due diligence very seriously, and we wanted to make sure that we were able to move forward with confidence so that our clients could do the same when this was offered to them at a wider scale. Next are pilots. This is key. We've been very fortunate to have some incredible partners on the merchant and the issuer side who are just passionate around authentication, around 3D Secure, and they've been gracious enough to trust us and to jump in head first and really push the boundaries and see how this solution could impact the market. As I'm sure Kevin will tell you here momentarily, much of what you'll see here today in the way of results is from those pilots and these early adopters who recognize the strong potential in this use case and those who have decided to move forward and begin reaping those benefits of Identity Check Insights.
Yeah, Matt, really couldn't agree more. Another thing we've had to do is just gain a deeper understanding of the marketplace. I'm sure everyone knows, right? There's a lot of movement within 3DS in general. So particularly things like regulatory mandates, different spec and protocol requirements, as the EMV spec has evolved, but also just different merchant and issuer use cases for the different flows and how those ultimately make their way into segmented authorization strategies on the issuer side. So there's no doubt there's a lot of potential here. And, really from the Mastercard perspective, I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface on how this frictionless use case can be applied across markets. But we have really started to see some scale in both the Latin American and the North American markets. And you touched on it, Matt, but we're starting to get to a point where we see robust enough traffic where we can start to fully analyze the impact of the solutions in what's really a statistically significant way. So we'll walk through a couple different case studies that point to performance results in both of those markets in just a few slides here.
Yeah, you'll see some pretty great stuff here in a moment, but just as that last bullet mentions, these case studies and proof points, they're only going to get stronger as we continue to reach that critical mass. We see those higher adoption rates along with more traffic flowing through the solution.
Absolutely, and obviously, just to stress the obvious point especially in the e-commerce environment, that authorization gap continues to be a major challenge, doesn't it? Compared to the average approval rate in a card-present environment, which might be hovering around the high 98, 99 percentile, that can be potentially 15 percentage points lower in the card not present environment, or as we'll see in certain regions, even lower than that. So a tool, a product like this could lend itself very well, especially in specific regions. And as you were saying, Kevin, it really does require a region by region approach. Obviously, PSD2 is going to require strong customer authentication within the European economic area, where this data-only solution may not lend itself well. But other regions, such as the Americas, it might prove itself to be ideal.
Yes, absolutely.
So before we do get to the results, because that's the exciting piece, Kevin, what does this slide tell us here?
Yeah, sure. So let me just pretty quickly frame up kind of the composition of this Mastercard risk score that I've been alluding to, right? And we call this Digital Transaction Insights, or DTI for short. And as I referred to, right, the score is driven by advanced AI modeling, but it's really specifically based on the authentication payload, in the EMV 3DS authentication payload specifically. But then the model interprets that data, and the output is injected into the authorization flow within Mastercard Security Solutions field. So look, we've been working really closely with issuers and really also with issuer processors for about 5 years now to facilitate some of the technical support and really mass enablement for some of these fields within authorization. And also, we've been able to incorporate this DTI modeling into our overall, what we call our decision intelligence score, that is available, has been for a few years, and it's really very broadly used in the U.S. marketplace across all transaction types. So what that means is not only can individual issuers key in on these discrete DTI bytes, but it's also automatically incorporated into overall fraud scoring that all of our issuers essentially get through the decision intelligence score. So quickly, I'll just take you through the makeup of this DTI score, which is passed in 3 separate bytes. So the first byte is relatively simple, right? It takes the form of a 0 to 9 score and just reflects the overall assessment of risk associated with each EMV 3DS transaction. The second byte we like to call it a risk reason code. So here we give a little bit more granularity as to the characteristics of the authentication data that's driving either a lower or a higher confidence assessment for that transaction. So a couple examples. Reason code E would indicate that there was a recent change in the device or the profile information, again, based on the authentication data. So that could be indicative of account takeover activity, for example, and therefore is higher up on the risk scale. In the scale, A is the highest risk and Z is the lowest risk. Whereas reason code T, for example, would indicate that from the network level, Mastercard assesses that there's more than one merchant or acquirer linkage that's been made with all the authentication data sent for that particular transaction. So again, more context, more granularity that we've been working really, really hard with all of our issuers, not just to have visibility in the score, but to work through best practices of how they actually deploy strategies that optimize performance using this score. So byte 3. We're currently working with some of our largest partners on the merchant side to pilot usage of this third byte. For now, for most transactions, this actually comes through as a kind of a placeholder value of G. But what we're moving towards is essentially a merchant-driven risk reason code. So this third byte is actually not dictated by the Mastercard models. It's actually supplied from the merchant's risk systems and, of course, supported by players like Cardinal to be inserted into the transaction flow. Now, we're rolling this out in a very controlled fashion, and we've spent much of the last 2 years collecting pretty extensive feedback from issuers in terms of overall usability, things like model governance, and ultimately we're also placing some parameters around usage of this code, really just to ensure that it's being used and populated as expected, when we do roll it out into the market. So again, just an example of another feature that we're kind of inserting into this whole insights flow in general.
Okay, very interesting. So really different ways in which the issuer's decisioning can be enriched, right?
Exactly. That's exactly it.
Yeah. Okay, so we've arrived. We've arrived at the results. What can you share, Matt, from those early stage trials here in Latin America, first of all?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So I'll focus first on Brazil before going to North America. But what's really interesting is we've been able to enable Identity Check Insights across a pretty large basket of merchants, specifically in Brazil, using some of our one-to-many processing partners in the region. So all that's to say is, this is not skewed or kind of driven by one large merchant or a few large merchants. This really does represent pretty robust data. From a data perspective, a couple things to call out. The 210 and the 214 codes you see here, these represent specific Mastercard security level indicators, where 210 basically identifies the typical non-3DS e-commerce transaction, whereas 214 is a newly introduced code that specifically highlights insights transactions within the authorization. So again, this is another really important field that, again, has been mandated into the ecosystem, but it's critical that it's passed because it makes the issuer's job a whole lot easier in terms of how they segment their strategies to then look at some of these additional risk signals, right? Whereas 214 will route it into a completely separate strategy bucket. They can then key in strategies based off of the GTI score, for example. So look, again, we've had really broad usage across a lot of merchants and enough traffic where we're really confident in that this is a statistically valid sample. We had some really good data scientists that have helped us to do this measurement, and it's led to about a 10% lift in authorization approval rates, which has been pretty consistent, during this specific measurement period. But I was just looking just late last week, and the results do continue, which is very promising, and has actually led some of our merchants to ramp usage above and beyond what they were doing as part of this test. So very compelling, and gives us a lot to look forward to in terms of talking about this use case with other merchants. So from here, I'll shift and talk a little bit about usage in North America, which has been a little bit different, but I'll say equally as promising, right? And I can't give the specific number, but we have generated insights transactions in the millions. A lot of which are actually coming from some of our largest digital players who are using this insights use case as a way to test their overall EMV 3DS setup, really in a purely frictionless, kind of a lower risk manner in terms of that cardholder interaction. So there's that population of merchants who may have business in Europe and may have separate deployments of their EMV 3DS technology for regulated markets. They've also looked to generate lifts and test into the integrations in North America as well. And then I'll say there's a second category of more traditional retailers that do have large e-com businesses. A lot of times there's been a huge shift towards the e-com business over the last months and years. And it's those players that have actually, some of them have generated really scaled usage to generate insights on a large portion of their overall traffic. So what does this tell us, right? What have we learned from this usage? So we've observed that actually a very large portion of the overall insights traffic in North America has fallen within the lower risk DTI thresholds, or those 1 to 3 scores on the left side of the market. So what that tells us is that the routing strategies and the usage is actually a bit different than what we've traditionally seen, especially in North America, from a 3DS 1.0 routing perspective, if you will. And it's yielded really strong results. The overall approval rate for all insights traffic in North America is right at about 94% over the life of solution. And that's well over a year of data. One relatively large North American issuer specifically has generated a 6% lift. Again, the same population of merchants, insights traffic versus regular e-com traffic. So look, we've shown some compelling stats both from North America, both from LIC on the approval rate perspective. Any fraud managers in the audience are probably begging to ask this question, right? What's the flip side of the coin, right? Driving increases in approval rates is only good if it can be done in a healthy way while it's also mitigating fraud. So unfortunately for data usage reasons, we couldn't display actual fraud data here today. But I just wanted to flag that as part of the typical insights engagement that we've been working directly with Cardinal, Mastercard is working on both the merchant and the issuing side to share the reciprocal view of fraud performance by these DTI scores as well. Again, all with the goal of safely improving transaction profitability, knowing that, and Paul hinted at this, right? Overall e-commerce approval rates are significantly lower than the card present space. But the latest number I've seen is it can be as much as 7 times more fraud that occurs in that space. So ultimately, it's only effective if it's solving both of those problems, while ultimately driving profitability for everyone. So that is a key piece of how we look at this as well.
And I think that's the one thing. Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
No, I was just going to say, and the one thing you may see a trend in these last couple of slides that I think is pretty interesting is, context, segmentation, and granularity. And we have all of those in a solution like this, right? So depending on how deep the issuers want or are able to go with their solutions, there are different levels of segments if they're able to make decisions off of a 210 versus a 214, if they want to do that in a more layered or intricate approach using the different DTIs. That is a part of this solution, and it's something that you can see where these benefits are coming from as you see the adoption and proper usage of some of these things.
Yeah, and what I was just going to add, I think just stressing point or picking up on a point that you had made, Kevin, that while on the one hand you can address the approval rate and potentially improve it, there is of course a risk of increasing fraud, and I think that's where it's critical that merchants make sure that they're working with an experienced solution provider, and certainly that's where the likes of a company like Cardinal will come in and will look at the merchant's situation holistically, not just approval rates but also their fraud rates, and how can we holistically improve the situation for that specific merchant. But those numbers are impressive. Like a 10 percentage point increase in approvals. God, if I'm a merchant and, let's say I'm doing $1 million of revenue a month, well, that's adding potentially about $100,000 to my top line, or over $1 million a year. Who's not going to be, interested in seriously evaluating this type of solution? I don't know, Matt, Kevin, can you comment further on that in terms of, when working with merchants, how they're evaluating this type of solution and, just walking through the process?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll jump in there. I guess more from the issuer perspective, Matt, and then maybe you can chime in on some of the merchant thinking. But what I will flag is we're not having to restart kind of the momentum that's been generated through some of this testing on the issuing side. We've now gotten the attention and kind of the engagement from, frankly, a number of large issuers in both North America and Latin America that represent a huge portion of the market, in addition to the processors who manage some of the auth and fraud strategies. And as a result of some of these pilots, they're now keyed in on these risk signals in a way that will allow us to scale this in I'll say a lower touch fashion, in that, the merchant won't have to go individually issuer to issuer to help to justify some of these increases. It's already been kind of built into the momentum of the ecosystem. And we've really started to see that momentum, translate to the performance results. Matt, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on just how merchants are thinking about deploying this or scaling to Paul's question.
I mean, similar to what you mentioned, I just wanted to piggyback on the fact that that's one of the purposes of webinars like this, right? It's the education piece. Is people have to know that these options exist and that they're working, and the more that it's out there, then it's a virtuous cycle where it's going to work better and better. And then on the merchant side, the thing that we would like to stress is the output is a score or a reason code, but the more data coming into that is going to get a better or more accurate score and code. So again, with EMV3DS having that potential to pass that rich data set, that's where we have this opportunity. Even if something's an optional field or it's conditional, we're advising a lot of our clients to pass more when they're able to or willing to, so that they can again get the benefits on the back end when those scores come out.
Yeah, and I don't think we can overemphasize that last point. It's obviously the timing's great, isn't it? It's with this new protocol now coming online, and the EMV3DS solution really just provides for so much more points of data. So on every transaction, compared to the old 3DS1, the issuer is going to be in receipt of so much more information. So there's no doubt that the timing's good, and with this new protocol supporting this specific data-only initiative, it's coming together nicely. So perhaps Kevin, you might want to summarize. I suppose alluding to the benefits that Matt had initially called out earlier on in the webinar, and what are the key takeaways here?
Yeah, absolutely. I know we've thrown out a number of different concepts today, but really from a benefit perspective, it all comes down to what we see on this slide. And then Matt will talk a little bit about how what next steps could be, or what it really takes, right, to implement a solution like this. So to quickly summarize the benefits of the insights, or even more broadly, the data-only flow. It's very easy to leverage in the sense that it's perfectly aligned to the EMV3DS infrastructure and the required payload of authentication data elements. So it's nothing incremental or net new. It's the same service providers in many cases that you will have been using for a previous iteration of 3DS. And you've probably gathered that players like Cardinal are already supporting this in the market now at some real scale. So it's being done, and it's being done successfully. Again, it guarantees that frictionless experience. Really from a technical perspective, that transaction's never routing out to the issuer ACS. So there's never a risk of that cardholder challenge or interaction not being presented smoothly because it's never being presented in this flow. And of course, it then reduces the latency for that same exact reason. That secondary leg of a typical payment authentication is now not occurring within this flow. We touched on the decisioning piece. So from the Mastercard perspective, we're able to add a lot of context to that authorization, and we've been able to embed it within scoring assets that are already very widely used from the issuing community. And finally, we didn't hit on this as much, but really we've started to see it serve as a pretty invaluable stepping stone, if you will, towards adoption of full payment authentication use cases for some merchants that may have a need for that full flow from a regulatory perspective, or even just from a balance of fraud in what they're currently seeing on their transaction population. So it can serve as a stepping stone, but also for some, it can act as the end state, right? And the end state may be a higher proportion of their traffic going this data-only flow because of the risk profile of the transaction. Or really, in reality, we're starting to see some of the most mature merchants move towards a blend of both of the use cases, both the data-only and the full payment authentication use case. So with that,
and I think that's...
Please, Paul.
Just to pick up on that last point, I think especially for those larger merchants conducting business in different regions, different markets, different conditions, that customized approach could lend themselves very well. In certain areas, it may make sense to fully authenticate, whereas in others, this data-only initiative is the ideal way to go. So very good. So I'm a merchant, let's say in North America or Latin America, and I'm liking what I've heard in today's webinar. What next? What can I do to potentially put this in place? Is that something that you might be able to touch on?
Paul, you're not a merchant. You work at Cardinal. Sorry, I didn't realize we're doing this. Okay, sorry. So,
hey, I might start singing
"Happy
Birthday," so don't get smart.
I don't want to cross you. Well, first and foremost, I'd like to say that no matter what your situation is, we're always there to help. So make sure that you're always welcome to reach out to a Cardinal representative, and we can have one of our solution engineers walk you through all of the requirements you need to get up and running with Identity Check Insights. When it comes down to it, though, you're probably going to fall into one of two categories. Either you're enabled for EMV3DS or you're not. And if you aren't enabled for 3D Secure, then that would be the very first step that you need to do. Work with, as Paul mentioned, a trusted 3DS service provider on enablement, register for the Mastercard Identity Check program, and then work with that provider to tailor an authentication strategy that works for you and works for your business. If you are currently enabled for EMV3DS and the Mastercard Identity Check program, then that's a great thing, because you shouldn't need to do any additional work or testing beyond appropriately flagging those transactions with that message category code 80 for the traffic that you want to send down Mastercard's Identity Check Insights. I would recommend, though, talking with your 3DS server account manager if you have one, just so they're aware of your authentication strategy and they can monitor its performance accordingly. One thing I did want to note is that we've also seen a number of merchants who've put in the work to support EMV3DS for those mandated regions, only to realize later that, or not to realize later, that they've done all or most of the effort involved for Mastercard's Identity Check Insights. So if you fall into this category, I strongly recommend considering the solution, or if you think that you fall into this category, again, reach out to us and we can work with you as a way of sharing that additional information authorization, which could positively impact your approval rates for a minimal amount of additional effort. But, again, Paul's going to put some information up here in a minute. We're looking forward to taking some questions. But again, just know that we're here to support in any way that we can, so that bridge is always there.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think that's a very good point. That last point you made is it's a very good point to stress. There could be plenty of merchants out there who have actually undertaken the work to integrate or upgrade to EMV 3DS for a mandated region, let's say Europe, in advance of PSD2. And they've done the work, in essence. They've got the solution there that could then be applied to let's say, other non-mandated regions where they do business. So merchants might actually be ahead of themselves. But yes, I think the best thing is to certainly contact a Cardinal representative, and then they can walk you through that. Well, listen, very much appreciate that, both from you, Kevin, and Matt. And we do have quite a number of questions in from the audience. So I will just randomly fire them at you and see if we can come up with credible answers. So there's one here. Are there new ECI values or any authorization changes required to support for either merchants or issuers? So are there new ECI values or any authorization changes required to support for either merchants or issuers?
Let me maybe jump in, from the Mastercard perspective, but the new ECI value corresponds to that security level indicator that I talked about a little bit earlier. So that from a Mastercard perspective, for the insights or data only segment, that value of 4 in terms of the ECI is then mapped from an authorization perspective into the 214 as an SLI, as a security level indicator. And again, we've pushed out notifications and directly worked with all of the large acquirers to ensure kind of understanding and processing of that. Now, on the issuing side, I touched on it a little bit, but really as part of our broader rollout of our authorization score called Decision Intelligence, there was a lot of groundwork that was laid going back a few years to mandate issuing processor support for the different security service fields. And one of those fields in particular are those DTI bytes, right? So there's been widespread processor support for those fields, and now a lot of the conversation is around ensuring issuers are picking up the fields and incorporating it into their actual decisions.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Here's another question, just taking a step back, because obviously the focus here today has been very much on merchants and the value of this solution to merchants. Somebody here is asking, well, what's the value for issuers? So, obviously, top of wallet is of key relevance to issuers. It's all in the interest of the ecosystem as a whole. But would either of you like to touch on that a little bit more, based on your experience working with the issuers?
Yeah, I can jump in first, Paul, and then I know that Kevin, you may have some additional insights too. That fraud in general is a very complicated problem that we're all trying to solve for, right? So I think what we need to understand is this was built for some of those markets where we haven't seen as much adoption of 3D Secure, or there's been some hesitation around that adoption. And we see that a layered approach is extremely important also, even if you are participating in 3D Secure. So for the issuers, anytime we can capture additional market to bring that data into the decisioning for the issuers and give them insight and visibility into those better decisions, it's going to be better for the merchant, it's going to be better for the issuer, it's better for the consumer, and it's really a win-win situation for everybody, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'll quickly add to that, Matt. One of the key factors, and I'm not sure if it came out in the webinar today, but and I believe this rings true across most, if not all, networks, successful process data-only transactions do not trigger, from the Mastercard perspective at least, do not trigger that fraud liability shift from merchant to issuer. So really this, and again, it's completely merchant-driven as to which data-only or full payment authentication or non-3DS flow they might use. But really it behooves all issuers to make use of the additional signals and the context I talk about in the transaction to boost approval rates in a way that perhaps doesn't send a signal that to gain the benefits of 3DS, the merchant has to route the full payment authentication flow that then generates that liability shift. So again, it's a key piece of the drivers behind the scenes, and it really has created a lot of interest and engagement on the issuing side to work closely with the merchants and with Cardinal and with Mastercard to prove out the benefits of this type of what I'll call a non-liability shift flow. So it's an important piece of the kind of overall economics of the transaction.
Yeah, and it's certainly, I suppose it's adding a bit of excitement anyway, isn't it? I mean, it's great to see more of this collaboration starting to take place. There's obviously this fundamental challenge that the ecosystem faces in terms of lower approval rates in the e-commerce environment. And, how do we work together, whether we're working for a network or on the merchant or on the issuer side? How do we work together to help close that gap? And I think this data only is an example of this type of activity that seems to be now taking up some motion. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. I mean, that's been one of the most exciting things, I think, about the pilot phase we did those was just bringing both sides of the transaction to the conversation, with the networks and with us in the middle, and understanding more about the protocol and just the ecosystem and how each side makes decisions. It's one of the benefits that we've seen as Cardinal, just always being able to sit in the middle and be a part of both of those conversations.
Yeah, very good. So, okay, here's another question. It really goes back to something you were touching on a short while ago, Kevin. The question being, what's the balance between using payment authentication and data only? Should I do one or the other, or should I use both? Perhaps you might want to expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And look, I think the simple answer is that it really is dependent on your business as a merchant, right? One size does not necessarily fit all, and risk tolerance and really down to the type of goods and the fraud risk within your business really ultimately is a driver of different use cases. And no doubt, Cardinal and Mastercard are very, very willing and eager to, get on the phone and talk through use cases that fit your business. But in terms of overall factors that, in terms of how this conversation tends to play out, merchant business model, the risk appetite, but also we like to think about it in terms of at the transactional level, what's the confidence that you have in the identity of that user that's prompting the payment? So, for example, in a mature EMV 3DS end state, and we've started to see some merchants go towards this direction, the decision to use data only versus payment authentication comes down to pretty robust risk segmentation. So, for example, the highest risk activity based on assets that the merchant has based on an additional payment authentication call may cause that merchant to actually suppress the activity altogether from progressing, through to authorization. But if we take that a step down and look at kind of the high risk or the medium risk activity where, we don't think this is a high volume type of fraud attack or anything very suspicious, but we still don't have full confidence that this is my good consumer, we would recommend that portion should be routed for full payment authentication, which allows additional evaluation of that authentication data, in that case, in the ACS environment by the issuer, but it also allows for the potential for that additional verification. And in this new EMV 3DS world, that additional verification in the form of a one-time passcode or a biometrics isn't necessarily the worst thing if it is the good consumer, right? So we look at that as kind of the middle segment. And maybe the low or medium risk segment is where you do have higher confidence as a merchant that this is my good consumer, but I want to be able to signal that confidence within the transaction flow so the issuer also gets that context and treats that good consumer appropriately. So again, those capabilities and kind of where those benchmarks would fall in terms of how volume gets routed could be wildly different for different merchant business cases, but it's that type of risk segmentation that we've started to see, some of the more advanced merchants deploy, even in non-regulated markets like North America.
Yeah, wonderful. It's really moving away from turning it on or turning it off. That we're becoming, I suppose with so much more data at hand that merchants can become a lot more sophisticated in their approach and how they can either authenticate or use this type of product for specific customer groups. So thanks for that, Kevin.
I would just say the fact that the merchants can flag their own transactions with the message category code also gives additional flexibility there, where they have that power to choose how they want to distribute their traffic or use this as a solution.
Yeah, very good point. Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. Is there a cost associated with data only?
Yeah, so Matt, let me chime in. Let me chime in from the network perspective, Matt, then I'll pass it over to you. But quite simply, because of the newness of this use case, there's no Mastercard cost in terms of a network fee to use this transaction, and that applies globally. We're really in a stage of kind of generating volume, proving out the use case for all merchants, so there is no cost from the network level.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. So when it comes to the network cost, like Kevin mentioned, there's no additional cost, but I would work with your service provider to understand the fees that are around that, because typical usage fees will still apply to this solution.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the bottom line is obviously work with your solution provider, and they can discuss the specifics of your business and determine what's best. Listen, Matt, Kevin, I'd really like to thank you both for joining today and sharing what I think was a very interesting story, and it's an emerging story, and especially dealing with the challenges of hosting webinar from your respective homes. So really appreciate that, and again to everyone on the call, we do hope you and your families remain safe during these difficult times. And hey, we look forward to joining you on our next webinar. And in the meantime, goodbye.